nice to be here again. Must say that I nearly didn't get here. I was going to take the other car and it had a flat battery. So Irene very kindly drove me here again. So here I am this morning. It's nice to be here. And I've been thinking overnight as well about how to introduce this topic because and why I chose this topic. And I've been thinking that people often, like I said, I have a PhD in sociology and I work in the field of public health using sociological knowledge. And it's kind of like, well, what is that? And how does that help us, right? And what I've been thinking is that I guess what is really interesting about the field of sociology is that just backtracking a little, last Thursday night, when Pastor Bill spoke, he really urged us to be thinkers, right? And so I think that this is what I'd like to do as a sociologist, is to really get us to think, because so often we just do. We do what is normal for us, we do what we've always done, and we don't actually think why we're doing these things. And this can be in the case as being a Christian. We can also just be doing without really thinking too hard. But it's also when we get a lot of messages from the world around us, right? And you see trends of things that are happening. I mean, we have this like now with the gender ideology that's come about. And there's these new trends that happen and come. And it's kind of like, well, what do we make of this? And sometimes it's really hard to know what to do. And I suppose this is where I like to use the sociological knowledge. It's like, well, what's the trends? Where are they coming from? Why does it matter to us? And then I think this is where it really pairs nicely when the theologians come in as well, and they come with the strong word of God, which I do try to do as well. But as you know, I'm not a theologian, so I'm married to one. And I do find that it goes really well together when you really like to make the hidden explicit, right? So the hidden thoughts that people have and just assumptions that they have, sociology comes in and it likes to make those explicit, right? So then this morning I have chosen to talk about truth-telling. And truth-telling is, you would probably think, around Indigenous stories. I ummed and ahed about doing this topic. As Pastor Wes can tell you, I took a long time to say what I was going to do my second talk on, but it just wouldn't go away. And so I thought, no, you know what, I'm just going to tackle it. And it is a relevant topic for today. We do hear about truth-telling all the time, and we do have the Indigenous issues that are before us all the time. So I thought, no, I'll just tackle this. And I'm going to do a bit of a walkthrough with history, just showing how the idea of truth-telling came about. My interpretation, my explanation. Someone else might have a different explanation, and I think it's quite interesting. I hope you will as well. And also then just bearing in mind what we've already heard other speakers also say, just really using the authority of God and the authority of Scripture as being our base, that's really the true framework that we need to be using. So that's what I hope to achieve this morning. So going back to truth-telling then, I've been puzzling over this term for quite a long time. I thought at first when I started doing the work on this speech that it's a new concept. Turns out I was wrong, and I'll explain that to you. But it's just really a puzzlement to me because truth-telling at first blush, it just doesn't actually make sense, I think, because it implies an understanding of truth. What we talked about last night is, the correspondence version of truth, the objective version of truth, that there's something out there. That's sort of like what you would sort of feel as if that's what truth-telling would mean, right? But I'm kind of like, well, that doesn't make sense in our postmodern world when truth is whatever you make it to be or whatever you understand or feel it to be. So it's like, well, how come now, at this point in time, has truth-telling become a thing? And that's been the question for me. Truth-telling, I suppose, as Christians is not a new thing. We know from the Bible, and we hear it every week with the 10 Commandments, that, we're supposed to tell the truth and don't bear false witness. That's in the 10 Commandments. We hear that all the time. Proverbs has a text about an honest answer being like a kiss on the lips. Psalms 34 tells us to keep our tongue from evil and our lips from speaking deceit. So, these isn't a new thing for Christians. The idea of telling the truth is basic. That's what we're told right from when we're little, right? Psalm 15 says, "Who can dwell on God's holy hill?" And the answer, well, part of the answer, is he who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart. So, truth is really important for Christians. And the New Testament's no difference. Jesus says numerous times, "I tell you the truth." Colossians says, "Don't lie to one another." So I think we get that as Christians, the idea of telling the truth. We understand it. But then it seems to be that when we talk about truth-telling, when we turn those words around, that and hyphenate it actually, so it becomes a term in itself, that it seems like we're talking about something different. And that's what I would like to explore this morning. So that is my outline. Just introduce the idea of truth-telling. I'm going to do a little bit of a history, and I will be doing this walkthrough. I'll get to that later, but I have this belief in the history of ideas. I think it's really important to know what ideas come when, and it's actually a really interesting pattern that you can follow. I will be talking about feminist standpoint theory. This is academic language, and it does come from academia, but as was mentioned last night as well, is what happens in academia does trickle out into the public, into the world, and the way we talk there does trickle out into the world, and you will see the connection there, hopefully. Coming back to pragmatic truth, which we talked about last night, and then hopefully we'll cover Christian discernment as well. All right, so when you hear about the term truth-telling today, you'll probably think about Indigenous issues. I know that's what I do. Straight away, that's the idea that comes into my head, truth-telling and reconciliation. And so you'll think of, say, something like that, what we've got here. You've got the Yurok Justice Commission, which is, as it says there, the first formal truth-telling process into injustices experienced by First Peoples in Victoria. So what is their role? So their role is, their task is to investigate and create a public record of the cause and consequences of the injustices suffered by First Peoples in Victoria since colonisation. So if you're Indigenous and would like to share your story about injustice, historical or otherwise, these are the people that you need to talk to. And, Justice Commission, it has an official ring to it. They've been commissioned by the Victorian government, and they'll be releasing their final report in 2025. And the result is that this will be an official record of injustices that have occurred, and it will become part of the recorded history of Victoria. Before we move on, I circled there where it says meet the truth receivers. And again, I just think this is a really interesting term when we're in a world which says, truth is whatever you make it to be, and then you have people who are truth receivers, and it feels to me like, if you're talking about truth receivers, that there's this transactional thing happening, that and so it's kind of like, well, there must be something that is the truth then, for you to be able to say, this is the truth, and I give it to the truth receiver. There's sort of this, and again, I'm kind of like, well, how does that fit in our postmodern world of where, sure, you can have that truth, that's fine. I can think something else. I can believe something else. As far as I can tell, this term is unique to this particular commission. I haven't seen it elsewhere and in other similar sort of setups. I think we do come back to that later as well. But I just thought it was a really interesting thing. So just as an example of the proliferation of interest in this topic of truth-telling, I found these two new books, and they are new. So they're both about indigeneity and colonisation. This one here by Henry Reynolds is about the colonisation of Australia, and the one on the right by Michelle Good is about the Indigenous life in Canada. So without having read the books, I think that we can pretty much guess that they would be in that framework, that paradigm of truth-telling, as similar to the Yuruk Justice Commission. I do just want to point out the dates at the bottom there, 2021 and 2024. So these are actually very new books, right? And I think that's interesting as well. Talking about how this is a new sort of concept way of talking about the past. So when I first started thinking about this topic and how it related to modernism, postmodernism, as I told you, I thought it was a new term. So I looked it up, and it's like, no, it's actually been around for quite a long time. And if you look at the timeline, the first instance was in 1597. Give license to my truth-telling tongue. Okay, we should be able to understand that. It's pretty straightforward, right? 1795, it speaks about truth-telling man. The sentence is linked to the truth-telling idea of sort of like this absolute fact. Then later in 1877, it speaks about truth-telling woman. That's the bottom one, right? That's nearly 100 years apart, so there hasn't really been a change there, I don't think, in the way you talk about truth-telling, right? It's kind of this adjective. It's a way to describe a person, and you would say that would mean that that's an honest person, right? They tell the truth, and that's how it's been used there. You've got the idea in 1843, you've got the truth-telling mirror. So that would be like, it reflects the truth back to you. You look into it, you reflect the truth back to you. Then even if you don't like it, and as it says, you don't like what it reflects back to you, and you break the mirror, it's not going to change the fact that the mirror will reflect the truth back to you. And again, still in that framework then of the idea that the truth is out there. It exists out there, regardless of how you want to see it and receive it, or try to change it. It's going to come back to you. Then in the early 1900s, we got 1908. We've got something about the truth-telling light of day. So again, the truth is there, the light comes in, makes it all clear, makes the truth clear. And still, I think all of these examples are in that idea that truth is out there. Truth is objective. It's something that can exist outside of what we say it is. It can exist whether we acknowledge it or not. Like again, with the example of the mirror, whether we want to try to change it or not, it's not going to change the truth, right? But then you'll see where my big arrow is that there's a big gap in the timeline. And that's the historical gap that we kind of want to talk about this morning then. And then you'll see that when you come down to 1997, that then suddenly you get the truth-telling in connection with the Indigenous issues and the Aboriginal voices. 2019, sincere healing and truth-telling. Truth-telling process, actually, which is an interesting word as well. So you see that I think that there's a big change here that has happened, right? But what's happened in that gap where the big red arrow is, and that's what we're going to explore. So the last examples, they are specifically with regard to Indigenous issues. So going to this gap then, right? I've got two examples here of how it was used, and it is in around in that time of the gap. Now, when you talk about a history of idea and you look at the timeline, obviously it's not going to be a perfect timeline, right? You will have, overlap sort of thing. Things happen earlier than you anticipate or whatever it might be, but you get this general trend of how things are moving along through history and how words are being used, or how things are being changed. So the example on the left is with doctors. And they use the term truth-telling with regard to like when they had to give a bad diagnosis to a patient, and generally say like a cancer diagnosis or something like that. And they actually use the term truth-telling as we've seen it this morning. And the question is like, should they tell them the truth or should they not, right? So in 1961, there was a survey that was conducted among physicians, and they found that in 88% of doctors, they followed a policy of non-disclosure when it came to bad news. So they preferred not to share bad news with their patient. Then in 1977, so that's over 10 years later, some investigators, they replicated the study, so they did exactly the same thing, sent out exactly the same survey to a number of physicians again, and this time 97% preferred to share the cancer diagnosis with their patient. So In 1961, you had 88% of doctors who said, nope, I would not tell my patient. And then 1977, 97% said they would share the diagnosis. So it's a really big flip in how they would see their role in truth-telling, the truth-telling that they should engage in. Should they do it? Should they not? And it's a relatively short space of time as well, this big change. The other example is salesman, like a car salesman, for example. And it's around the ethics of whether you got to disclose whether, particularly used cars, if it's got a problem or not. And between the 1960s and the 1990s, there was a big discussion that was held around the dilemma of whether they were obliged to tell the truth and disclose the truth. So a salesperson, they have obligations to their company that they work for. They're obliged to support the company, put their best work forward in the interest of the company, and that means doing the best in sales as well. But they've also got a moral obligation to their clients. Socially, we expect everybody to tell the truth. We expect salespeople to tell us the truth. We know that honesty is important for the maintenance of ongoing relationships and the maintenance of good reputations, and that's also in business. If you don't feel like you're not being told the truth, you're going to probably move on to another business if you can. So then, with these discussions, they eventually made a code of ethics for salespeople. This was in 1994. Sort of like, towards the end of the discussion, they came up with this. I'm not expecting you to be able to read all of that. It's quite small, but I did highlight the terms truth-telling, and you can see it comes up 4 times in this code of ethics. So 4 times they ask the question about truth-telling. The first question is, does honesty require truth-telling in this situation? All right, and that would be around the social expectation of that everybody is honest. The second question is, does the receiver have the right to truth-telling? And again, you've got the word receiver here, where, like I said, it's got that transactional feel about it. Like there is a truth that one person holds and they give it to another. And so in this case, the buying the car, do you have the right to know the truth about the car? And then the other 2 on that side, they talk about the reputation of both the salesperson as an individual and the company, the organisation, whatever it is that they're working for, about their reputation. What kind of damage or not would be anticipated through telling the truth or not. So in both of these examples, I don't think that the dilemma is around truth as such. I think it's more around whether you've got to tell the truth or not. So, with the doctors, if you have cancer, the truth isn't about do you have cancer or not? And it's not like you can live with both ideas. I believe I don't, you believe I do, and we can live happily ever after. It doesn't work that way with something like cancer, right? In the case of the salesperson as well, there's a truth there. Either the car does leak oil or it doesn't leak oil. There will be evidence of either situation. So in both of those examples, I think it remains in the paradigm where the truth is external. It's objective. It's something there that can be tested and verified. Going back to the doctors who changed their minds from 1961 to 1977 about disclosing a cancer diagnosis, I don't think that they changed an idea about the truth of the matter, the truth of the diagnosis, but it was more about the relationship of the doctor and their role in looking after their patient, how they saw themselves and how they viewed the competence of the patient. And I think it was that change in attitude more than a change in the understanding of truth regarding a cancer diagnosis. So, both of these dilemmas, it's more about the dilemma whether to share or not the dilemma of what's true, if you can see the difference there. And I think that this shows that at this point of time then, so this would be in the 1960s, 70s, going towards the 1990s, that the paradigm of truth hadn't really changed, not for the general public anyway. is the way the term truth is used, and the imperative then to tell the truth. It's still within the understanding that there's an objective truth out there. It's just about whether I need to tell you or not. So just very quickly didn't change. There we go. Very quickly, just going back to correspondence version of truth, and I know that Pastor Wes also talked about it later in his second speech as well. Just to recap, especially if you weren't here last night, just really talking about, I used this picture just to explain that, like, the idea that objective truth being out there, it needs to correspond. If I describe something, it needs to correspond. There's a truth out there that is objective. It exists independently of how I describe it or how I say it. It exists. It can be uncovered. It can be tested. It can be verified. That's the understanding of this version of truth, correspondence version of truth. So if something is out there, it doesn't come and go as I think about it, or it doesn't change as I think about it. The truth is out there, separate, it's independent. Sometimes we talk about this as, truth with a capital T, or we'll talk about the real truth. Objective truth is also a word we've been using throughout this conference. Yes, that changed. Okay, so how has then truth-telling, what's changed in the way we use the term? And this takes us back to the Udall Justice Commission, and when you click on the slide, this is the next one that you come to. So this describes the truth receivers that we talked about, and what's really interesting here is that now if you look at the way they're using truth, it does fit more with our postmodern idea of truth, right? They're talking about sharing their truths, and truths is plural, right? So we do have this dilemma where, are they in the postmodern version of truth where it's like, yes, whatever your truth is, and it's their truths, their narratives, I suppose, which before, when we first investigated, and you think about truth receivers, it seems to fit in that objective truth paradigm. But I would say that, if we look at this, I think in the end they do land more in the more relative paradigm where you can accept the my truth, your truth sort of framework. And notice that the word truth is not capitalised here, so in which I do think does indicate that they don't have the idea of absolute truth or real truth as we've been talking about. And plural, as I mentioned. Okay. All right, so just a little bit more history in truth-telling processes and the new concept of justice commissions. So one thing that we did notice in our timeline, the earlier timeline I had up, is this introduction of the word processes, truth-telling processes. I think that's a really interesting and significant as well. And the reason why I say that is because I think that at the time when the first fleet came and English settlers came to Australia, I think that there was a pragmatic truth that was being bandied around. And that, as you have probably been taught at school, is the idea of the terra nullius. Because I think that it would have been really difficult to, if you came and landed here, and there are many accounts of interactions of settlers with Indigenous people. They had regular interactions with them, good or not good. So I think it would have been really hard to actually, on the ground, say, yes, there's nobody here, that the land is uninhabited. And yet that was the official stance, that was the idea. And that's the idea that Australia was founded on. And I think that comes back to our idea of pragmatic truth, that it was handy. It was a good idea, that it was convenient to believe that this land was terra nullius. It was convenient because then you could just walk in and, guilt-free, really. Remember last night I talked about how pragmatic truth is often about power, and the victors are the ones who dictate what story can be told, and I think that's the case here. The settlers, and particularly the Crown then, they were the ones who dictated how the story would be told. Another pragmatic truth that people believed in was that white people were superior, particularly to Indigenous people. Just as a note, Charles Darwin's book on the origin of the species was first published in 1859. We usually think of Darwin as promoting the idea of biological evolution and natural selection. So development and evolution happened in the biological world, and then that would support progress and development in the species as we know it today. That's how evolution basically works, right? But similar ideas are actually supported in the social world. And that actually did really strike me when I started studying anthropology at how strong the social Darwinism is. It's quite astounding. And this is kind of like where the idea where historical development is equated with human progress, human and social progress. And so it promotes the idea of the survival of the fittest, which meant that the stronger is naturally the one that's going to rule. And maybe even eliminate them. And so socially, this justified and naturalised ideas like classism, racism, and colonialism. People saw this as the natural order of social progress. Europeans were obviously stronger, obviously more socially developed, and therefore it would be natural for them to subjugate the less developed people. And if those races died out in the process, well, that was just natural selection. That's just the way it was going to happen. It is very interesting that around this time, anthropology, they got in a bit of a tiz, I suppose, and there was a real lot of energy put into documenting people like the Indigenous, and part of the impetus for that was that they believed that they were going to die out. So it was kind of like this salvage anthropology that was happening. People were rushing around the world trying to get the last records of the way these people lived because it was so fascinating, thinking that they were just all going to die out. Going back to like a history of ideas, and I've given you dates in all of this as well, I just think it's really interesting to think about when these ideas correspond with major events, right? So the first fleet was in 1788, Darwin was 1859, he died in 1887. One of his contemporaries, who was a strong supporter of social Darwinism, that's Herbert Spencer, he died in 1903. And the stolen generation policies were approximately from 1905 to 1970. So I do think that colonialism would not have been possible without the support of these social ideas. And now we get things like the Yurok Commission, right? And these ideas are now being contested. And alternative histories and narratives are coming to the fore. So I see these as attempts to undo that strong narrative of the victor's version of history. But as we say, that doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and that's where now we're getting what's called truth-telling processes. And that's what these commissions are about. So just as a little bit of a history, the first one was in 1995. Just thinking about our timeline, and what I've said about the ideas that are around, floating around at that time. 1995, that was the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2007, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I think they started work on that actually in the 1980s already. It took quite a long time to get that officially accepted. 2007 to 2015, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. 2020, there's a proposal for the United Nations, I think, or the United States, I can't remember now, Commission of Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. There's the proposal for that. It hasn't been decided whether it's going ahead or not. And then we got the 2021 Yurok Truth and Justice Commission in Australia, which is probably going to finish in 2005 if they stick to their deadline and get the report out. All right, so where does this leave us, and what are we going to make of this, right? What happens for things to make it possible to move from truth-telling to be about telling the truth being a real or external truth that exists independently of the speaker. So what happens for that now to become a truth-telling process? And where's the process taking us? What fundamental shifts happened probably in around, our big gap, around the second half of the 20th century. That's where that big red arrow was on my timeline. And I have a proposal that there were two things that happened. One is the understanding of truth, that changed, and then I'm going to explain to you the feminist standpoint theory, which, as I said, is an academic thing, but it does trickle down, and you'll see the application of that when I speak about it. So yeah, last night we did talk about 4 different paradigms, and that is really the understanding of truth which changed. Going from the idea that it's an objective thing out there to, and basically pick your truth, pick your way of understanding truth. And I'm saying that with the idea of terra nullius, that they had chosen a pragmatic truth at that point of time. Let's go to our next slide, and I will explain feminist standpoint theory. It's actually really quite interesting. Comes back to the question of truth. All right, so how do you know something is true? What makes something true? We've talked about objectivity, and also in my work, being a researcher, how do you know that you're objective, unbiased? Try to separate ourselves from whatever it is that we're observing, and just explain. Kind of like this objectivity then, or perceived objectivity, was sort of the authority that gave him claims to truth. But then feminism came along, and then they claimed that, well, actually no one can separate themselves from the situation. There's no such thing as an objective, unbiased person, right? So we have a quote here from, this is Donna Haraway, 1988. She says, "Feminist objectivity is quite simply situated knowledges." So in other words, it's throwing out the whole idea of a God view. We did talk about God view last night, and also that Pastor Wes was very strong on that God is the only one who does see all, does know all. Now the feminists would just say, no, there's no such thing. Everyone's situated in particular positions. There's age, gender, socioeconomic, education, etc. And all of these factors will then shape your perspective. The only way to be objective is to acknowledge those positions. So that's what will make you objective. And my idea on this is that I do think that we need to be honest in being forthright about our positions, because they do shape how we see things, how we understand things. But I think that's more about being honest and transparent about why you claim things or why you see things the way they are. I don't think that by acknowledging those, or then saying, acknowledging those, that's going to make you objective, that will then produce some sort of objective truth. Or later, as we'll see, if you talk to that group, that they will have a more objective truth than another group. I kind of think that that's not really the way it would work, because we're all bound by our position and perspective, right? So another one here is from Sandra Harding. Lost the date on this one, but this is from 1993. And she argues that starting off research from women's lives will generate less partial and distorted accounts, not only from women's lives, but also of men's lives and the whole social order. So it came out of feminism, obviously, from the title, and therefore that's why we got the focus here on women's lives, but it can be applied across the board, and it is applied. People do use this theory and apply it across the board, anywhere where you've got marginal groups, right? So that would include Indigenous, it would include refugees, migrants, possibly minors as well. And the way this theory works is like this. All right, and I'll give, this is the way they would approach it. Say you've got a family in your church. Okay, they've been married for about 20, 30 years. They've got a number of kids who are teenagers now. They've always been seen as a good, solid family. The husband's sometimes an elder or a deacon, and the wife usually participates in church activities, as do the kids, right? So it all looks good. But then after, I said they've been, married 20, 30 years, something. Then she starts making the claim that all is not well at home, and her husband is actually abusive. Maybe physically, emotionally, financially, whatever, and she leaves. All right. So what's our immediate reaction when you hear about this? And often we would kind of go, well, she's the one that left. So you kind of see her as the bad one, right? And people find her claims hard to be true because they've seen this family in operation for a long time, right? And they go, nah, don't believe it. I don't think this is true. And elders have worked with him in consistory and they go, nah, this can't be true, right? But then feminist standpoint theory comes along and he goes, well, you got to start with the woman, not the man, right? That's where you got to start your investigations, right? And they have a premise. The premise is that the marginalised people, so the smaller people, shall we say, that they always have to do a lot more hard work to be believed, right? And this, if you think about social order then, as they said, that impacts the whole social order. If you think about it, men tend to have more sway than women, right? Think about it in our other example of Indigenous. Who would you naturally believe? These are just biases that we have, right? And it tends to be that the marginalised people, they have to do a lot more work to be heard, to be believed, to be understood. And then the second point. So if you think about this case from the woman's standpoint, from her place, there's a lot of hurdles that need to be overcome to be heard. Right? You think about it, think about what she's risking and will probably lose, right? Her marriage, her family, her status as a good woman, stability, also financial stability, right? And she's got to count the cost of all of those hurdles. So this is what standpoint theory says. It's like if you start with her, what's it going to show you, right? And then you also need to consider what other women are saying around her. Like, are there other people who kind of go, probably. Not surprised, Other people may have seen things, may have heard things. The trick would be, of course, to find them because people aren't going to necessarily volunteer this sort of information. And it probably, small interactions, comments, or maybe they've helped her in the past. But I do think that there would be women who would have some interesting observations in this case, right? And I can give you an example. I was talking to someone after church and we'd been talking for a while and then the husband comes up and he goes, time to go, and walks off. And she trotted off. And I was like, we were talking. I was a bit, flummoxed. and I was stunned because it was like there was no, you ready to go or shall we head off now? There was none of that. There wasn't even an excuse of like, come on, we got to hurry because we got to see so-and-so or anything like that. And I was thinking about this from this perspective then. And it was like, well, the men wouldn't see this kind of an interaction because he was talking to the men and then came over to collect his wife. So they wouldn't see this kind of a reaction. And I'm not saying that there's a concern here, right? And I don't have a concern with this particular situation. But at the same time, at one day, if there are ever any claims, those are the kinds of things that I would remember and go, okay, interesting, right? So back to our quote here from Sandra Harding. And she says that when you approach the situation from the woman's perspective, you'll get a less partial account and less distorted account. And she claims that starting from the woman's account will give you feminist objectivity. And I don't think that we can conclude from this that if you start with different group of people, or whether that's women or whether that's Indigenous, that you're going to get an objective truth just because you started from a different point. And I think that's where I've always really hesitated with this theory. I'm much more comfortable with saying, yes, everyone has different perspectives and different perspectives do reveal different things, but to actually then take that step further and claim objectivity and objective truth, I think that's a step too far. Because then I suppose you got to ask the question of like, if you're going with that account, does that make the other untrue, right? Maybe, maybe not. But perhaps the other is also from a different account, a different perspective and a different position. So going back to this, so they say this is an example used with women's lives. She said that we need to start the stories from the women's perspectives, and it will just give us not only information about her particular situation, but it will also give information about the social order, right? Like the norms about gender roles or etc. We can replace women's lives with Indigenous lives, it would work just as well. So starting off research from Indigenous lives will generate less partial and distorted accounts, not only of women's lives, but then also of others, whoever the other groups are, and of the whole social order. And I think this is where it comes into this whole thing of processes, that we've got to think about the process that these people are taking us on. Where are they going, and what truths are they being driven by? What pragmatic truths are they also being driven by? And again, question, does it matter? We talked about this last night. We talked about it with our various paradigms of truth. It's relevant again for now. So does it matter if we have a Justice Commission that's collecting stories of telling colonisation and retelling colonisation? Does it matter that it's starting from a different point of view, not the Indigenous point of view? And where do we see ourselves in this? At the beginning of the talk, I did say that we want to talk about a Christian perspective here and think about our Christian discernment in this, because this is stuff that we hear and see living in this world today. So what do we make of it as Christians? And to go back to that, I do want to just go back to the pragmatic truth, not to explain what it is, but again to see how it works in operation. I said that the terra nullius philosophy was a pragmatic truth because it allowed people to come here guilt-free. If they'd acknowledged the presence of Indigenous people, and I mean now in an official sense, so that the Crown actually acknowledged them, then things would have necessarily been done differently. They either would have had to declare war, or they would have had to make a treaty of sorts, which would then allow them to live in certain areas, under certain conditions, etc. Would it have changed the outcomes on the ground? Maybe, maybe not necessarily. Okay, but it would have been a different story. It would have been a different historical account of settlement of Australia. And the thing that bothers me about this is that Christians were part of this process of colonisation, right? And they've also gone along with the whole terra nullius version of history. Probably also accepted the social Darwinism sort of idea. It was very prevalent. And the way we live in society, the way we live in a culture is that we do absorb ideas that are around us. That's what's so good about a conference like this, where we can actually unpick some of these things and talk about them, make them explicit and challenge ourselves to think through some of these ideas. So as an example, of how people were just part of a system, right? And I think that's the way we got to see it, that when you're part of a system, and we talk about being countercultural, but how do you do that? How can you actually do that and so often I'm sure that as Christians we let things slide and we let things go. And I suppose, part of a conference like this, we'd really want to sharpen those ideas so that we can be sharp in our thinking about the way we think about things. So, for example, in Western Australia, there's an old farm near Margaret River. It's called Ellensbrook, and it was a government-run farm home for Aboriginal people, and it was run by the Bussell family. So the area that the farm was on was actually traditional camping grounds before for Indigenous people. But by all accounts, the Bussells, they were good people. They was a good family. They had a number of Indigenous people working for them on the farm, and they also housed approximately 10 Indigenous children. They fed them, clothed them, taught them. And when you walk through the farmhouse now, it's been turned into a museum. It's quite a lovely spot. In one of the rooms, it's got a special piece about Edith Bussell, who was the lady of the house. And it describes what she did for the Indigenous people. And it's actually really nicely done because, we tend to see that so often things are trashed and people's reputations are trashed because we have a new way of seeing things now, right? But this piece is actually really nicely done and it speaks quite well of her and the things that she did and the care that she gave to the Indigenous people and the Indigenous kids that came in her care. But at the same time, it also acknowledges that she was part of the system, part of the big system, part of the government system, which was, taking children away, for their good. And so when I see this sort of a story, you kind of think, well, what if that was me? How would I be acting? What kind of belief paradigm and truth paradigm would I be working in? Because you're just so much part of the system. And I'm putting this picture up again. I quite like this picture. Takes us back to the fishbowl, that we are so much in our own perspective. We're so culture bound, we're time bound. That's why I did the history of ideas, the timeline that we looked at, and the way ideas changed, the telling the truth to truth-telling processes, sorry. We're also stuck in our own perspective, and it's so easy to adopt and take on pragmatic ideas of truth, pragmatic ideas that people may just say, right? And you kind of nod and you operate out of those same truths. And for example, some of the things that I do think we need to examine for ourselves is ideas around, for instance, abortion and euthanasia, gender ideas, refugees. Some of these ideas, are there pragmatic truths that we are harbouring, that we are adopting? Because pragmatic truths have consequences. It's important, and it's important that we do examine them, and examine them in the light of the Bible. Do they hold up? Because yes, they will have consequences. It will shape your decision making, and it will shape the outcomes of your decision. So pragmatic truth will allow you to act in certain ways. So, for example, we hear very often that, say, for in abortion, in a pragmatic truth would be that it's not a person yet, right? Believing that would allow you to do a certain action, right? And that's how a pragmatic truth will work. And I kind of think we really need to think about that for ourselves. Are there ideas that we are accepting which will determine how we act? And I think that the only way that we have any hope is to live according to the real truth, and that is to examine our ideas in the light of the Bible. And so I like this text. I chose this text to really just ground us towards the end of this presentation. And it comes from Isaiah, and I think it just really nicely puts us in perspective. Having the picture of the fishbowl, where we're on this earth, we're small, we're people, we can only just see what we can see, and comparing us to God, right? And the text is that he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. So God is the only one, we talked about this last night, God is the only one who has that God view. He's the only one who is outside of our earthly perspective. And not only that, but he sits enthroned. And I think enthroned is a really good word here. Like, he's in control. He is the sovereign ruler, and he's enthroned above the earth. Also means that he has the God view. He's the only one who can see everything throughout history, throughout time. He can see how we are changing our ideas. He can see whether we are operating out of pragmatic truths which are not true. And he sees everything that happens within the circle of the earth. So that's what it's got there, the circle of the earth, which really gives the idea of the finite, limiting, sort of container-like perspective that we have. So God is enthroned above the limits that we experience. And yeah, like I said, he sees everything, and people are just like grasshoppers. So that's a really humbling thought right there, that we sometimes think that we're so important and we got it all right and we know what we're doing, but people are just like grasshoppers to him. And there's such a contrast here that between the Almighty God that cannot be contained within the world, sits above the world, and the reality check that we are just like grasshoppers for him. So that makes us humble and aware of our limitations, included being limited to our own cultural time and place. And I think that this is really important. And I suppose this goes back to the whole thing of that we need to be thinking, we need to be reading, we need to be examining what we are thinking in the light of what people have been saying previously, saying before. I think Pastor Wes said before the 1900s is probably a good time, because the new ideas have come about since then. God can read our hearts when we're living out of pragmatic truths. He knows when we are really, I suppose, deceiving ourselves, or when we're really truly following his word. He can read our hearts. He knows that. He's given us the Bible, which is the only way that we can have any hope of gaining any perspective other than the cultural one that we live in. So this is why it matters what truth paradigm we hold on to. Because if we're going to follow the pragmatic version, well, basically we will be swayed with whatever idea is floating by at the time. It will shape our thinking, it will shape our decision making rather than the truths of the Bible. But if we're going to hold on to correspondence version of truth or objective version, knowing that there is a truth out there, that there is a truth that can be found, as the Bible does tell us, then we will believe that God is enthroned. He is enthroned above the earth. He made the world and he continues to uphold it. And then we can hold on to the teachings of the Bible and apply it to any situation. And I think this includes the way we can then think about truth-telling. And the truth-telling, as I've been describing it, the truth-telling processes. And I think the Bible will help us to work out how we're supposed to think about that. So just as some key takeaways here, quickly, as I finish, I just want to leave you with these two. First of all, I think that we've got to be really careful to examine our own paradigm of truth, the way we see the world, the way we believe it. Are we really holding on to that objective truth that is out there, as we've been saying numerous times throughout this conference, and believing that there is a God and that these things are real, and that there's going to be consequences, that there is a heaven, there is a hell. It's real, right? Are we going to hold on to that, or are we going to sort of smudge things and find other ways of explaining things? And then the second one is that we need to really be careful to examine other people's paradigms of truth. And that's what I've been trying to do tonight, last night and now as well, just to really examine how other people are thinking, because at the end of the day, we are living in a cultural context, and it's very easy to be swayed and affected by the way other people think and talk about things. But we need to assess where they are standing, also to see where they are going with their pragmatic truths, right? Where are they going with their processes? For instance, we had the quote up there, and the ultimate aim is like changing social order. So what does that mean? Where are people going with that? And I think that if we can be more and more alert and aware, then I think we'll be so much stronger for it, and be able to really just hold on to that God is truth, and that truth as objective truth does matter. Acknowledging that God is the sovereign ruler. So that is all for me this morning. Thank you, and enjoy your coffee, I suppose.
Thanks, Dorinda.